My experience in the room was terrifying. A fragmented loop of unease and despair. 1408 was a horrible dream, yet somehow I awoke from it.
What? Another dream.
The remake of Silent Hill 2 is littered with a bunch of Easter eggs and cute little references to the original, and to other Silent Hill games in the franchise. And after beating the game about a month ago, it really got me thinking of the what-ifs and the possibilities of the other Team Silent games being given the same remake treatment. A lot of people, including myself, consider Silent Hill 1 being the game that would have benefited a lot more with a remake. However, if I were to personally choose another from the original collection, one can dream of a remake of Silent Hill 4, The Room, which I believe to be another good contender that would really benefit from a complete overhaul because of the potential the game had underneath the occasionally broken, janky, and frustrating experience littered with a bunch of really weird design choices. Overall, the game really lacks in terms of quality when compared to the other Silent Hill games, and was really held back by a lot of its problems, which is a shame because the game really had a lot of things going for it, such as the game's story and concept. It was already layered with an interestingly unique plot and setup, as well as having one of the scariest and most interesting characters in the Silent Hill series to serve as the game's main antagonist. This game also had the suspense, the build-up, memorable scares, and great horror elements that would have potentially made it a really great horror experience. But because of the game's most prominent issues being related to the gameplay, combat, and its design, some of the things that are intended to evoke fear just turn into frustration, and a lot of the bad unfortunately drag down all the good things I like about it as a game. And it's unfortunately something I'll be dreading whenever I consider doing more playthroughs of it in the future. Which sucks because that may also be the reason as to why a lot of people tend to avoid experiencing this particular game, and even excluding it from the classics due to it being too different from the original trilogy. I'd say the game itself is a conceptual masterpiece. It's a really great concept, however, as a game it's less of an enjoyable experience. And I know the Silent Hill series isn't really known for its gameplay, but at least for the first 3 games the combat worked okay. Plus, you didn't really need to fight sometimes, with a lot of the monsters being complete chumps that are easily avoidable in certain areas. Silent Hill 4's combat still works and also does the job, but a lot of the issues come from weird hitboxes, clunky combat and controls that feel surprisingly worse than the previous games, and from the way enemies are designed to act around you. It is possible to just outrun them in this game too, but there are a lot of moments in which enemies attack in large groups, can block you from passing through, are way faster than you can run, and can even shoot you from a distance, which pretty much forces you into fighting anyway. All of these things I mentioned about the game are just a few of the issues on the surface, and I'm willing to discuss all the other things I've noticed, especially since the game is still fresh in my mind, having recently played the PC version of the game. For more context, I have played through this game twice, my first time on the original PlayStation 2, and the second one being on the PC, which is most of the recorded footage you'll be seeing on screen. And although I don't really intend to go too deep into the lore and development history like you would expect from a proper retrospective, I'll try my best to incorporate the important parts that may relate to my own observations of the game. As for the things I'm going to be discussing, it's going to be most of the things you'd expect when it comes to the game's design, mechanics, and everything I find annoying, without diving in too deep into the lore and story elements. And it's not necessarily going to be in whatever order, I'm just going to do my best to connect them with one another. That being said, let's just jump into it.
Help me! Help! Let me out of here!
There's something going on in this room.
What do you mean?
I heard weird noises coming from inside there.
Help!
Hey, Richard, can you see anything from your window?
No. Everything looks pretty normal to me. The guy who lives here, what's he like anyway?
I know his name and face, but that's about it.
Well, I'm gonna go call the super.
Yeah, good idea.
Damn it. They can't hear me.
This all starts with our normal everyday guy, Henry Townshend, happily moving into his new home in South Ashfield Heights, room 302 being his apartment number. It's been about 2 years since he moved in, and unfortunately for this guy, recent events start to happen, and it's revealed to him that the room he happened to be staying in seems to have a few exclusive amenities just for him, such as strange nightmares, no one being able to hear him, windows suddenly closed shut, and his own door being chained from the inside. And at this point, I guess you'd easily come to the conclusion that this was no ordinary room.
It's an evil fucking room.
There's also this weird hole in the bathroom that may or may not lead to something promising, but at this point, Henry doesn't really have a choice now, does he? So might as well crawl inside. As far as openings and setups go in the Silent Hill series, I think this works pretty well. This was already a better intro compared to the opening and first couple hours of Silent Hill 3, in my opinion. Which is a game I really love, by the way, but one of the only few issues I had with it is that I don't think it really starts up until you reach your apartment, which is nearly 2 hours in. The first hours of the game can also come across as a bit sudden and especially confusing to those who haven't played the first game and are unaware of any of the context surrounding the Order and the backstory behind Heather. The only motivation they could relate with her in the beginning of the game was that you wanted to go home and find out what's really going on, which was alright I guess, but it's not really that interesting. In Silent Hill 4, the motivation and the way to empathize with our main character was already made clear right off the bat. The idea of Henry being trapped for the past 5 days and finally finding a possible escape route serves to give him that sense of agency, of wanting to find a way out to survive. Character motivations aside, let's talk about our main guy, Henry Townshend, and his personality, or lack thereof. I know a lot of people in the Silent Hill community tend to have their own headcanons about things, with some of them even looking way too deep into characters and things in the franchise, to the point of harassing Masahiro Ito himself on social media, but none of that really matters in the case of Henry in the context of Silent Hill 4, since he really isn't the main focus of the game's narrative anyway. I'd argue this guy works just fine as the main protagonist, since he pretty much serves as a character that players could project themselves into and witness all the game's events through him. He's even given the title of the Receiver of Wisdom as part of the 21 Sacraments ritual, which might as well just be a reference to whoever it is behind the controller. There are, however, a lot of theories and interpretations about his character and how he relates to all of these events, with themes such as isolation and social anxiety being the ones that I found really interesting. But that might just be a discussion for some other time. And although I believe that the Henry we got in the game still works as a protagonist, I also agree that they could have thought of a way to incorporate something about Henry's psyche into the mix, or even just to hear more of his thoughts in order to make his character less bland than a piece of bread. Which is funny for me to say, because even though he acts and responds to situations like a David Lynch character, this guy is strangely still pretty relatable for me. So there's that.
What the hell? What the hell? What the hell? What the hell is this? What the hell? What the hell? What the hell is this?
I think the devs probably wanted to take a different route and add a bit of a twist to this entry, since the previous 2 games already had the whole personal fear aspect as a big part of the game's narrative, and they didn't want it to be repetitive, I guess. Although I'm not so sure if that's one of the reasons specifically. And that's the thing with making Silent Hill sequels, and it could be one of the reasons on why it's so hard to make one. A lot of the Western Silent Hill games, for example, tried to follow the same pattern of its predecessors, but seemed to suffer a lot from the James Sunderland syndrome. Grabbing the idea from Silent Hill 2 just with a completely different character, with their own personal fears, and slapping in some new monster designs. With even some games just straight up stealing some monster designs and ideas from Silent Hill 2 due to it being so popular. That's why I respect Silent Hill 4 for at least trying to switch things up a bit, by focusing more on the fears of someone else other than the main character, just like what he did for the first game, except with the twist being that everything you encounter represents the memories, victims, and the pain of our main villain, Walter Sullivan. A deranged serial killer on a personal mission who seems to be knowledgeable when it comes to navigating their own version of the otherworld to use against you, which is a pretty terrifying situation to be trapped in. One of my favorite things about Silent Hill 4 is how they handled the suspense around Room 302's gradual corruption, and the build-up to Walter Sullivan as the main villain and narrative lead. He doesn't really appear until later on in the game, but you do get to uncover a lot about his backstory through memos and through the characters and locations you visit. And although you don't get to see much of Walter in person in the first few hours, you do get to feel his presence when making your way through the levels. Another thing that makes him such an interesting character for me is because of his motivations and behavior, which doesn't seem to fit any of the patterns that are usually found with traditional serial killers, which makes him a lot more unpredictable. He also has a very soft-mannered way of speaking despite being who he is, which makes him even creepier.
I got this from Miss Galvin a long time ago. She looked so happy, holding her mother's hand.
I'm also a fan of the whole lore behind his character, his tragedy of a childhood due to his connections with the Order, and together with his obsession and main motivation of performing the 21 Sacraments ritual in order to cleanse the world of its sins and reunite with his mother, which he believes to be Room 302 itself, the place where he was born and left to die, abandoned by his real parents many years ago. At this point, I feel like it would be best to just jump into the horror and gameplay aspect of Silent Hill 4, since I could write for a whole day about the lore and story and it still wouldn't be enough. And I know there are a bunch of other videos out there from people who would probably do a better job explaining than I could ever do. Also because explaining the lore isn't the point of the video, so there's that. Which brings us to the big question. Is the game fun? Just kidding. That's probably the last question you'd ask when approaching a Silent Hill game, or most survival horror games for that matter. So if you're looking for some fun in a general sense when it comes to gameplay, there's not much to see here. Also, people don't play these games for fun, they want to feel vulnerable. They get scared for the banger soundtrack, the banger narrative, getting lost in the atmosphere, getting lost with the said atmosphere, and probably the most important one, of course, the aesthetic, which is definitely the reason why I play these games.
Am I crazy?
Which brings us to a much better question. Does Silent Hill 4 at least succeed in scaring the player? The short answer would be yes, with the long one being also yes, but only half the time. And the reason why I say this is because of everything I mentioned earlier on. A lot of the scares in this game are mostly ruined by so many of the frustrating things you're going to be dealing with as you move forward. And it doesn't help with the fact that this is probably the hardest Silent Hill game compared to the other three. But before I get to those, I'd like to give credit to the horror elements present in the game, starting with the monsters and their designs. This franchise is home to a lot of weird creatures, but Silent Hill 4 probably has the strangest combination of monsters. Most of the enemies in this game are kinda lame and uninteresting design-wise, with only a few notable ones, such as the disturbing twin victims and its variations, as well as a few of the ghosts you encounter throughout the game. But the weirdest one of them all? Wheelchairs. Yeah, still can't really wrap my head around these enemies. But aside from the weird enemies and bosses in the game, the true MVPs in making this experience incredibly frustrating has to go to the ghost enemies, which are unkillable, floaty bastards that follow you around and drain your health the closer they get. I really do like the idea of it, with each ghost representing the past victims of Walter Sullivan, but their implementation into the game makes it a lot harder for players to look around, and pretty much forces you into focusing all your energy into fighting to stun, and then running away from them, instead of exploration, which was originally a big part of the Silent Hill games. The game does provide a way to put a stop to them through the use of a special sword item, but there are only 5 of it in existence, and it can be difficult to decide whether to use it or not. And as far as I can remember, I've only used it twice in the game, with one being something you're required to do to retrieve a key item needed to progress further. Now let's talk about the atmosphere of Silent Hill 4, which feels like a drastic change from the atmosphere of its predecessors, both visually and in terms of the game's vibe. It definitely feels a lot weaker as well compared to the previous 3 entries, but I believe it does a good enough job of giving you that unsettling, dreamlike confusion, when especially paired with the weird layout of the locations you find yourself in. The changes with the inventory system and the removal of the flashlight and portable radio is a pretty big part of why this game feels so different. There were a lot of dark areas in the previous games, and the flashlight served as a way to help navigate through the darkness in certain areas, with the portable radio helping and alerting the player if there were any monsters nearby. I guess Silent Hill 4 didn't really need any of these since a lot of the locations are considerably well lit, making it easier to see enemies around without the need of a light source or a portable radio to sense danger. A lot of the monsters also attack in groups, give certain screen effects, and are very loud, so there's no way you'd be completely clueless on whether or not you're in danger anyways. And speaking of loud noises, the sound design and soundtrack are equally important parts that make up the atmosphere of a horror game. And in the case of the game's original soundtrack, in my opinion, Akira Yamaoka was yet again able to deliver us with another great collection of foreboding, ominous instrumental tracks, together with a few awesome vocal tracks thrown into the mix as well. And yet, despite the soundtrack being such a cold, hellish banger, I can't really say the same when it comes to the game's sound design, unfortunately. This is by far the worst sound design I've ever experienced in a Silent Hill game. I can't even say that it's part of the game's charm, or that they add to the game's creepy dreamlike atmosphere, because a lot of the sounds in the game are just really bad and take me out of the experience. Like for example, Henry's annoyingly abrasive footsteps on certain material that I didn't really notice at first. This game also uses a lot of stock sound effects. The sniffer dogs, for example, make this generic big cat roar sound effect that you'd probably already heard a million times in other media. It doesn't really make sense with their appearance at all. One of the more horrific examples of hilariously bad sound effects come from these nurse enemies at the hospital world, who make these burps after taking damage. This just made walking down a particular staircase in the game an unintentionally funny encounter. One of the better parts of this game has to be with the implementation of Room 302, which serves as a sort of safe room similar to the ones you'd see in the Resident Evil games, and it pretty much has the same function to that. You're able to access the room and go back and forth between the real world and the other world through a series of holes scattered throughout the levels. Going back to the room enables you to save your game, and staying in it will gradually heal you from any of the damage you've taken from the other world. And since this is the first Silent Hill game that limits how much stuff you can bring with you, they also added an item box feature that can be used for managing and storing the items you find. The room is also key for certain puzzles throughout the game, and for transferring memos that are blank that can only be read from the real world. And even though you're trapped with seemingly no way to contact anyone outside for help, you're still given the chance to have a glimpse into what's happening to the world outside of your room, through the windows, peepholes, and through radio broadcasts.
Warm and sunny weather continuing through the evening, and the weekend we can expect more of the same. So I hope you all get out there and enjoy your weekend.
Putting everything else aside, the most unique thing about Room 302 is the twist that happens about halfway through the game, when Walter finally wants you dead. You see, for the entire first half of the game, you pretty much do things in the familiar Silent Hill fashion. You make your way through each area, meet a few people in the level, solve puzzles, fight a bunch of guys along the way, and make it to the end, which usually involves Henry witnessing the brutal deaths of the people he meets, each revealed to be the next victim of the 21 Sacraments ritual. In the second half of the game, however, only two potential victims remain: your next door neighbor, Eileen Galvin, and you, Henry Townshend. At this point, the game makes it clear that you're next on the list, and everything and everyone wants you dead this time. The room that originally served as your safe room no longer functions as such, since it becomes haunted, and a lot of weird things start to happen, with each of the hauntings being able to slowly drain your health the closer you get to them. And to top it all off, staying in the room no longer heals you from any damage, requiring you to depend on the health items you can find. You're still able to go back to save and store items, but each time you return to your room, there's a chance of seeing a haunting or two that can hurt you and can increase your chances of getting one of the bad endings if left to prosper. So you'll have to get rid of them with the use of saint medallions and holy candles scattered around. The hauntings in the room are great and disturbing and all that, but what I find even more disturbing is the fact that the last few hours of the game got the Devil May Cry 4 treatment and require you to go through the exact same levels you just went through, except in a slightly different way. There aren't even any significant changes to the area, and the level design wasn't even as interesting to begin with, so having to go through the same levels twice without that much to justify it just makes it a complete chore to go through, and made me wish for the game to be over already at this point. To add to the pain, you also had to bring Eileen with you, and depending on whether you protect or neglect her will affect the game's ending. The game does allow you to decide if you want to leave Eileen in her room, as to make things easier for you to navigate and collect what you need without distractions, although leaving her alone in rooms with enemies and her taking too much damage would slowly give her these red marks that make her prone to possessions that can drain her health. And if she gets too possessed, it's pretty much impossible to get the good ending. She can also be given weapons to help out, which is cool, but I wouldn't really recommend doing so most of the time, especially if you intend to protect her to get the best ending.
Considering the circumstances, I guess we're doing pretty good, huh?
Walter Sullivan also plays a new role in the second half of the game, in the form of a Stalker enemy type. and he's able to follow you around through the levels, although only limited to certain areas in the map. I actually don't really mind the addition of Walter as a stalker enemy. I personally thought it was a cool idea, since him finally showing up to kill Henry himself also makes sense at this point in the narrative, and it really does add to the sense of urgency. I also just really liked the way they introduced him in this part of the game. The cutscene that played was pretty creepy, and once he started to go after me, it did catch me off guard the first time, since it took a while for me to process what was going on until I heard his laugh and when he started firing in my direction. Walter's also not really that difficult to avoid, especially when you know what you're doing, although he can be a bit frustrating and scary sometimes, especially when he uses his gun and stun locks you from a distance. But aside from that, him being a stalker enemy, it's not that bad. It's fine. Also because he's kinda stupid, so it's fun to mess around with him.
What the hell is this?
So I guess that's pretty much all I have to say about this game in terms of how it is. I think the best way to describe Silent Hill 4 The Room is that it's a game that I really love in theory, but also a game that I realize I don't really like as much when I put it into practice. I'm pretty sure there are a lot of things that I forgot to mention, but I guess that's fine. I didn't really intend to make this a deep dive or anything, or even a proper retrospective. To be honest, I just wanted an excuse to give the game a revisit and rant about a few things as well, while also documenting it into a video format just for the fun of it. But yeah, if this game were to get a remake in the future somehow, I'd be down for it. I believe getting a complete overhaul could provide us with the fully realized versions of a lot of the concepts and ideas that the game had. And as for the studio who'd work on it, obviously I already have faith in Bloober Team. I know they probably have plans in making their own properties, but you know, it's just an idea. I personally think they did pretty well with the Silent Hill 2 remake, which I enjoyed a lot, and yeah, that's pretty much why I even made this video in the first place. I just kept imagining the idea of Silent Hill 4 getting the same treatment as Silent Hill 2. Modernizing the game, getting rid of all the broken things and all the clunkiness, and giving it a bit more polish. And yeah, that's pretty much all there is to say. So yeah, I don't really know how to end videos yet, so I'm just going to leave you there. Good night.